Hi, I'm Jim Marshall. I'm the president of the United States Institute of Peace, and I welcome you all here. It's actually, for me, a pretty sad occasion. You think back to the referendum that was held, 3 years and 1 day ago in South Sudan, how peaceful it was and how joyous the population was, not only at the result, but simply the process, a peaceful resolution of disputes in a part of the world that for decades had struggled with violence as the solution to problems. And now we're back to, at least hopefully only temporarily, but we're back to using violence to solve our problems. And it's just a shame, and I think everybody here knows that. And certainly most of South Sudanese know it very, very well. The Institute has been very actively involved in Sudan and South Sudan matters for decades. We were part of, we were involved and a strong supporter of the comprehensive peace process. And besides Princeton Lyman and John Temin, who are on the stage with us today, both we have a number of other members of the Institute who have been actively involved in South Sudan matters. Ambassador Bill Taylor, who heads up our Middle East and Africa programs, as well as David Smock, Linda Bashai, Susan Stiggin, and Jackie Wilson. All of them have been actively involved in South Sudan matters. Here on the panel, we have some very experienced individuals, and I'm going to bore you a little bit perhaps by reading bios that were given to me just a little while ago, and since I couldn't just pick through the bios, I thought I'll just read them to you. Ambassador Princeton Lyman is Senior Advisor to the President of the Institute of Peace. I guess that means me. You're my advisor. Is that the way that works? Ambassador Lyman was appointed United States Special Envoy for Sudan in March of 2011. Immediately preceding his tenure as Special Envoy, he served as U.S. Senior Advisor on North-South negotiations, where he led the U.S. team focused on supporting ongoing negotiations between the parties to Sudan's 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement. Ambassador Lyman's previous career in government included assignments as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, U.S. Ambassador to Nigeria, Director of Refugee Programs, U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, and Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. I'm sure most of you already saw it, but I thought Princeton had a very good op-ed in the New York Times, 2 or 3 days ago? Focused specifically on this issue. Ambassador Alan Gulti is Global Fellow for the Africa Programs at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Gulti retired in 2008 after 40 years of service in the British diplomatic service, including postings as Ambassador to Tunisia, Sudan, and the UK Special Representative for Sudan and Darfur, where he led the UK team in the Navasha, well, I don't know I can't say it, so peace talks. He was Director, Assistant Secretary Equivalent for the Mideast and North Africa of the FCO, and from 2000 to 2002, he also served in Cairo, Washington, Khartoum, and Beirut. He was a fellow at the Weatherhead Center for the International Affairs at Harvard. Kate Knopf is an independent consultant on African issues and global development. She served previously in various capacities at the USAID, including as Assistant Administrator for Africa, Sudan Mission Director, Deputy Assistant Administrator for Africa, and Special Assistant and Senior Policy Advisor to the Administrator. She's an adjunct faculty member of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University and recently served as the first visiting policy fellow for the Center for Global Development, both in Washington, D.C. John Temin is our Director of Africa Programs at the United States Institute of Peace. He travels to Sudan, South Sudan, and other countries in the region frequently to assess developments and meet with government officials, civil society leaders, and diplomats. Mr. Temin's commentary on Africa issues has been featured by, among other outlets, the BBC, Al Jazeera, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Voice of America, and National Public Radio. He also testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations on Sudan and South Sudan. Prior to joining USIP, Mr. Temin spent 5 years with the non-governmental organization CHF International, designing development and peace-building programs throughout Africa and elsewhere. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you very much, Jim, and good afternoon, everybody. I do want to add as well that we are doing this event in collaboration with our friends at the Wilson Center, which is where Ambassador Gulti comes from, so we add our thanks to them for the collaboration on this as well. Our plan today is a bit different than how we do these things sometimes. We're not going to do any formal initial presentations. We're going to go straight to some questions and some discussion with three panelists who are obviously very well versed and have a lot of experience on these issues. And we're going to do that in two parts. First, I'm going to have some questions and to moderate some discussion amongst them. And then we're going to go to the audience for questions. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions in the audience. I'll say it again later, but I will ask everybody to be brief in their remarks so we can have as many voices in the conversation here, particularly a lot of South Sudanese voices, because I know we have a lot of South Sudanese friends here. Let me also welcome everybody who's watching this via the webcast, and people who are watching the webcast will also have a chance to ask questions when we get to that stage. So to start off, I think we want to begin by talking about the urgency of ending the fighting and the crisis in South Sudan. And in a moment, we'll get to some of the longer term issues. But just to start on that point, I want to ask the panelists, what do you want to see in the next few days, in the next few weeks, to bring an end to the fighting, to bring an end to the bloodshed? And I'll start, Ambassador Lyman, with you on that.
Well, actually, it's my understanding that a lot of the technical arrangements for a ceasefire have been agreed at the level of negotiations that have taken place. What isn't there, of course, is an agreement by the leaders on either side to a ceasefire. And I think that depends a little bit on how they see their military situation. But I think pressing ahead for that agreement as a first step is essential. Now, there's a lot of pieces that have to go with that. There's a verification process, there's a monitoring, and then you have elements that are not necessarily under the control of those two leaders that also have to be brought in. But clearly that has to be the first step, and then the understanding that from that will flow much more.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Gulti, Kate, do you want to pick up on that?
Let me just add on the question of monitoring that this is absolutely crucial. The obvious monitors are the UN force in South Sudan, which so far has not distinguished itself. But the best model in the Sudanese context is the JMC in the Nuba Mountains, where the parties to the ceasefire assumed responsibility with international help for monitoring it themselves. Now, this is a big ask in present circumstances in South Sudan, but I don't see outside monitors policing a ceasefire in present circumstances without a good deal of cooperation from both parties.
Thank you.
I would just echo the point on the ceasefire being imperative and without condition. I think we've probably all seen the news of the IGAD mediators' attempt this week to obtain the release of the political detainees, and that's a critically important issue going forward, especially for an interim political settlement and for any longer-term dispensation, I think, for South Sudan, it should not be a stumbling block to a ceasefire. And I think we all need to put the utmost pressure possible on both President Kiir and on Riek Machar to move immediately to freeze in place and not to continue the violence one day longer. Then I think we need full unimpeded access for humanitarian response. It's really quite stunning how quickly and how many people have been affected by the crisis, and what the potential is for that to escalate exponentially further. How difficult it is to get access to them already is very, very troubling. And both sides, all sides that are in control of guns and any territory need to move quickly and cooperate with the international community on that front. And then I just flag the human rights monitoring points as well, that there have been far too many horrific stories coming out across the board of atrocities and violations of human rights that need to be documented and fed into some process that maybe we can talk about later, what that could look like.
And let's go to, as you mentioned, the IGAD efforts and some of the negotiations that are happening in Ethiopia right now. We have representatives from the government and from those aligned with Riek Machar. Do you think that the right people are in Addis in order to craft a meaningful deal? If not, what more needs to happen? Who else needs to be there? What more do the IGAD mediators need to do? Kate, do you want to start on that?
I think that's an excellent question. Clearly, we have to have the two main protagonists at the table and get their agreement on a ceasefire. That will have a calming effect, one hopes, on all the other various forces that may or may not be fully aligned or fully under the control of particularly the opposition and the rebels at the moment. And so continuing the immediate ceasefire talks with those two main parties is very important. Clearly, Riek Machar feels like he needs other people at the table for him, and that I think has to continue to be something that we all press on in terms of the release of the detainees. But I think more broadly, and I would welcome to hear the opinion of my co-panelists, that the question of whether these two camps, so to speak, get to write the deal, the political framework going forward and for any transitional interim phase, and then getting to a point where we could have a new permanent constitution in South Sudan and a political process that might take us out of this crisis and this cycle of violent competition in the longer run. So I think that's where we really have to think hard about expanding who's at the table, who's in those discussions. There are many voices, I understand, in South Sudan who are neither in the Salva Kiir or the Riek Machar camp, and they need to be heard and part of this process as well.
You know, if IGAD were capable, and I'm not sure they can, is to run two processes here. One is the ceasefire, and you have the right people there if they have the authority. It isn't who's there so much as do they have the authority from the principals, Machar and Salva Kiir. Ideally, you would have also start a broader political process that would bring in other people to begin to talk through what is the follow-on political process. I'm not sure IGAD is up to managing that, which is, would be, I think, ideal. I think there's a mistaken notion, I think, on Machar's part as well, that by releasing the detainees that they're all going to come over and represent him in Addis. I don't think that's true. Some may be important to him on his side, but certainly not all of them. So that is almost a separate part of this separate political process.
I want to pick up on the way you started that response, which is if IGAD is capable, and you pose that as an if, and so I want to push the question a little bit. Is IGAD capable? But also, is the greater continent of Africa capable? We talk a lot about African solutions to African problems. I think many of us are supportive of that notion. But when a real crisis like this hits, it raises a lot of questions about African capability to resolve it.
I don't think, from what I know of the structure of now, of the mediation, that they barely have enough staff to do what they're doing now. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to have IGAD lead, which they should, this broader thing, they would have to build up a much bigger structure from the African Union, drawing on help from the UN and others, to really be able to do something more. That means more staff, more structure, et cetera. And I think they should aim for that, but they're clearly not there now.
Ambassador Gulti?
I'd caution against complicating the process more than absolutely essential. If you think back to the CPA process, it was very, very difficult to get the two parties into the room, let alone all the others who would have liked to be there and all those with hindsight who said it could have been much better if I had been there. Look at Darfur. 8 years since all the parties were in the same room. 8 years. So let's keep it as simple as possible. The two groups we've got at the moment for the ceasefire, then I entirely agree with Princeton. It has to be a wider process for the Constitution, which is already mapped out but not happening, and for drawing up a political program. It seems to me a key for the way ahead is not just a division of spoils, who gets to eat next at the government trough, But what is the government to do? What is its policy to do? That could be initially negotiated by these two parties who represent at least some of the big political beasts. But you have a parliament in Juba. A program can be submitted to that, and then you could move forward with a constitutional process with a lot more people there. Can IGAD manage this? Well, they have managed a complicated process in the past. Certainly, they may not have enough personnel at their command to staff every single job. But if they have, as General Sumbewo had from 2002 onwards, support of the international community, united and coherent and backing the mediation, then things become possible that look most unlikely when you start. In 2002, I don't think there were more than a handful of officials all over the world who gave the negotiations a chance, and yet it produced an agreement 2.5 years later. So it can be done. But the cautionary Sudan tale is that of Darfur, where you had lots and lots of observers milling around in Abuja. And Paul Selim, Ahmed Selim, who's trying to run the mediation, found it extremely difficult to cope with this babble of observing voices. And not only a babble, the observers didn't get on with each other. I vividly remember my American colleague, who had much to say on those occasions, saying absolutely nothing when there was a Libyan observer in the room. So you've got to work together. If we all work together, IGAD can do the job.
Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about the roots of this crisis. The three of you have been involved with this country and United Sudan before it for a long time, and Ambassador Gulti and Kate, going way back to the CPA period. Does what we've seen over these last 3 weeks surprise you? Does the speed at which it's accelerated surprise you, Kate?
It's shocking, I think, what's happened in the past few weeks. In terms of surprise, the political tensions, I think what's surprising is how quickly it became so violent and unraveled and turned upside down, essentially. As I think back on some crisis moments in terms of the timeline, at least from 2001, getting to the point we're at now in 2014, this, I think, is what we more expected and feared when John Garang died. And we were really uncertain how the power politics were going to play out in the South, and succession of the SPLM and of the government, the interim government of Southern Sudan that was barely getting on its feet at that moment. And it didn't happen then. I guess that's one reason why I say it's not inevitable that it happened now. While I think it is surprising in the ferocity of it, it's clearly playing on tensions and on fault lines that were there, but why they triggered this specific descent into chaos and into all-out warfare, I think is it's shocking.
Well, some of this more immediate crisis started, you could see it, or people there saw it happening at least 1.5 years ago, and that was two things. The great dissension within the party about the way the country was being governed, about the shutting out of the party, about the way President Kiir was making decisions, the use or non-use of the cabinet, et cetera. And at the same time, seeing that Riek Machar was going to make a bid to challenge Salva Kiir, which the people in the party recognized was an extraordinary thing that could split the place apart. The question was how to manage that. As we had a discussion here, as you may remember, John, with some people, if the party didn't offer Riek Machar a pathway to the presidency, there was going to be a crisis, a possible split. If you did offer him a pathway to the presidency within the SPLM, there'll be opposition from the other side. How to resolve this? Do you create a president, prime minister? Do you do a variety of other things? The problem was that the party was not only unable to deal with this, President Kiir didn't trust the party to do it. Instead, he began to see all these people as his enemies and was moving in general toward, clamping down on dissent, etc. So the party, as an institution that had to manage this crisis, failed completely. Then you have an army that's really a coalition of militias, and it fragmented. There had been no real integration. This crisis has been brewing for some time, but like Kate, that it unraveled in such violence so quickly, I think took a lot of us by surprise.
And so if that's the case, let me add a question on top, and then we'll go to Ambassador Gulti, which is, if we saw some signs of this coming 6 months ago, a year ago, is there anything that could have been done to prevent it? Ambassador?
That's a hard one, John. Would it be easier to persuade the Tea Party to accept tax increases?
We don't do domestic issues at USIP.
No. We could have perhaps taken a bit of action sooner, and I defer to Princeton because he may have been taking this action behind the scenes in making it clear to people in office in South Sudan that the way the government was being run, the murder of Isaiah Abraham, for example, in 2012, was unacceptable. And perhaps that could have been done sooner. Whether it would have had any effect is a different question. But when you get to the stage that even those of John Prendergast venture a slight public tap on the wrist in July, you know that things are pretty serious.
I guess, trying to see this, and I wasn't directly involved in these last few months, but as it was moving more and more toward crisis, and you could see, particularly by December, that the President Kiir was not going to use the party. He was pushing people apart. There were threats of this kind of a split. Would it have made a difference if the international community had then come together in some very strong public as well as private statements that that warning people that any major split, any resort to violence would result in very strong international sanctions and reactions? I can't say whether that would have made a difference, but perhaps.
Okay, and let's keep moving now and talk a bit about what's to come and the road ahead. Ambassador Gulti, if you thought my last question was difficult, this one might be more, because I want to ask about the SPLA and what's to be done with the SPLA, because we've seen it splinter so easily, so quickly over these last few weeks, and this is to all of you. But what can be done with this very large army that clearly is not very unified and is at the center of the fighting right now?
The first question really is, what is the SPLA for? The whole background was of resistance to the north. But how many of the 200,000 or however it is in the SPLA now are engaged in defense against a possible threat from the north? I would suggest not very many. Most of them are taking their turn to eat. They have fought in the bush, they've served, they've had a very hard time, and now it's time to sit back and enjoy the fruits of their efforts. So most of the resources devoted to the SPLA go on salaries. It's a complete waste. Nobody asks the SPLA to do anything. We have wasted 8 years. We could have started from 2005 in creating engineering battalions. What does South Sudan need? What we lament every time we talk about the subject? Lack of infrastructure. Why hasn't the SPLA been providing the labor to build roads with local people, to construct bridges with outside help? Why isn't the Army Corps of Engineers in charge of training the SPLA, not the other parts of the American system? So my answer to that is, firstly, make the SPLA earn its keep. Can you stop it being tribally based? Not without a lot of education. How many of the SPLA are illiterate? How many, for that matter, are suffering from HIV/AIDS? I believe it's between 4% and 5%. what is the language of command? Is it Juba Arabic, or is it Dinka in a Dinka battalion, or is it Nuer in the Nuer area? There needs to be, if there's to be a common approach to the SPLA, a common language, a common discipline, and above all, what is lacking, a common narrative of what it means to be South Sudanese. Up till independence, that was supplied by opposition to the North. Now there needs to be a positive narrative, and that has yet to be constructed.
Kate, you want to pick up on that?
I am not a security sector expert, and I wish I had more answers or suggestions to make in this regard. It strikes me that of all the broken, incomplete, and fractured institutions in South Sudan, the SPLA, from what we've seen these past few weeks, is clearly one of the most challenging, if not the most challenging, institution in terms of how to pick up the pieces again when the fighting stops. The reports of violence that I'm aware of mostly are attributed back to men in uniform of some sort or another, and that suggests that not only restoring the confidence of the people of South Sudan in their security services, but within the security apparatus itself, and particularly the army, how to bring units back together, how to deal with the ethnic divisions that many of what we're seeing happen outside of Juba. Much of the violence seems to be falling out on those lines somewhat. Cohesion within the SPLA and finding this national identity and a professional outlook in terms of providing security to citizens of South Sudan and not taking resources and benefits for oneself is a key thing. As I've reflected back on more on the aid program side and some of the approaches and the strategies over a number of years, getting to the CPA and post-CPA and looking forward towards the referendum and the end of the interim period. DDR was a really difficult question, and it was, I think, one that we fell short on, perhaps as donors, in terms of what we could do to come alongside the process that, at that point, Salva Kiir was very strategic and forward-thinking on, in terms of bringing in all of these various rebel militia groups, other armed groups, whatever we want to call them, that now we see splintering back off to a significant degree. He brought them in. He succeeded in stabilizing the South-South fighting for quite a number of years through that process. Obviously, it couldn't end there, and I think if more support had been given, perhaps to what could these individuals productively do, how to find a professional core army within that, and then give hope for economic livelihoods and other possibilities to the majority that probably needed to be moved on from the army was one area that we now need to think a lot more seriously about, and how we can be much more supportive when that moment comes going forward.
But see, the point is that it was structured the way it was because it was a part of a political unity process. You were dealing with an army that had been not integrated, absorbed by a lot of groups. So you can't quite separate what you do with the SPLA from what you're doing politically, because how do you manage all these generals from various different factions, all of whom were paid off basically to come in with their soldiers, before you had a political process? We talked about it a lot, but I think one of the things we were not able to do, and I can't tell you how many months we spent on this, to try and establish a kind of a professional understanding and agreement among ourselves, I have to say, about how you approach the reformation of the SPLA. And we never really reached it. I think the general concepts that you described, everybody thought about, and thought of it as a multi-year process, but we never really were able to make that programmatic, and partly because the structure was based on something else.
Yeah. Let's turn to another aspect of trying to put South Sudan back together, which is justice and accountability issues. We talk a lot about those things in forums like this, and a lot of good ideas about it when agreements get made, particularly in the history of Sudan. And now South Sudan, those things often get swept under the rug. If you agree that that's a bad thing, if you agree they should be more prominent in agreements, how can that be the case in this situation?
I think it's going to be a difficult issue to deal with. You have to deal with it. At the same time, some of those people are the people you're sitting down at the table with to get a ceasefire. What I would guess is the best you're going to get out of this, and it is not ideal, is that somehow in this political process of where we're going from here over the next 2 years, constitution, et cetera, that there is created a justice accountability process, a combination of trials and truth-telling and amnesties, but also at a minimum that most of those major figures who are responsible are not in the government after the next election. That generation of leadership is going. Now, whether they get jailed or punished, et cetera, at a minimum, they shouldn't benefit from all of this.
The difficulty is holding out the prospect of accountability and some form of action to those very people whom you want to compromise and reach agreement so that you can move forward in an atmosphere of security. And that is not easy without a lot of compromising of our own principles and settling for something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was talked about at Machakos, but the Khartoum government shot that down because they thought that they would be blamed like the apartheid regime in South Africa. But some form of commission on those lines seems to me the only possible way forward. Nobody is going to negotiate himself into a jail. And harking back, if I may, for John, to the last question, an anecdote which illustrates some of the problem one is up against. I was in the Lair district in 2003-04 and called on the local SPLA commander, and we discussed what he might do after peace came, because we could see there was a peace agreement looming. And in my naivete, I suggested that he might join the civil service and administer the area from which he came. And he said to me, "But I do that already, and I have all the women and cows I want with no human rights or laws to stop me." And it's that attitude that stops you making easy agreements with warlords, with militia commanders, and indeed with much of the SPLA.
I guess I would just offer here that we try and listen as carefully as possible to South Sudanese voices in terms of how they would like to see justice and accountability and reconciliation go forward, and not just the voices at the table, and recognizing that their incentives to negotiate are powerfully affected by this discussion and how this set of issue is handled. But there's already some fantastic recommendations out of the South Sudan Law Society. Probably many people have seen that in the last few days by David Deng and another lawyer, Elizabeth Deng, giving really thoughtful, constructive South Sudanese informed perspective on what would make sense going forward. Here are some ideas to start trying. So, well, we have a lot of best practice and I think examples from other countries and other experiences around the world to help inform. It really is up to South Sudanese to decide how they want that accountability to be handled going forward, and for us to support that in the best way that we can with our technical resources and assistance and lawyers, and also our voice in terms of insisting that somehow it be handled, because we can all see that this crisis is playing off of a lot of unresolved grievances and the lack of justice from the previous war. So,
I want to go back to something, Ambassador Lyman, you mentioned a little while ago, which is the party, the SPLM, and its seeming inability to manage some of these tensions that have exploded out into the open. We talked already about the SPLA, but what's to be done about the SPLM? Does the party have a future as a single entity?
Well, it is the ruling party, and there aren't very many serious opposition parties unless this results in a different composition of parties. And therefore, as long as they're the ruling party, what happens inside the SPLM is critical. And I think, as I mentioned before, people recognized for some time that the party mechanisms weren't working, that party democracy, to the extent it ever existed, was not functioning. But it's a very weak structure. It doesn't have decades of political thinking and organizations and philosophy, et cetera, behind it. It's not the ANC. And so there's going to have to be a lot of soul searching within the SPLM. But I think that reform is going to be critical because, at least in the near future, they are the ruling party.
Want to pick up on that, Ethan?
I mean, just to acknowledge that they are the ruling party, but there also needs to be space for other political parties and clear room for opposition or minor parties to develop and to, or for a split to take place. If that's, that may be the way out here. And so internal party reform, but also clear political space for other parties to exist and robustly participate in the political process of South Sudan.
But Princeton, if the split were on ethnic lines, would that be a step forward or back?
Depends. There's always going to be a degree of ethnicity in it, and there is in a lot of countries and situations. Depends on how that's pursued. If it's pursued in a political process, it's manageable. If it's pursued with a military base, then it's a different story. And that goes to the structure of the polity, the rules of the game for political parties. A degree of ethnicity is not surprising. When I moved to Massachusetts and I was living in a house owned by an Armenian family, and they said we're Republicans because the Italians are Democrats. So, but they don't go to war over it in Massachusetts, thank God.
All right. I'm from Massachusetts. I want to turn the conversation now to some of the regional dynamics and also go finally to U.S. role in this and then turn it over to the audience. But to talk a bit about the regional dynamics, two countries in particular on either side of South Sudan, Uganda, who we've seen are clearly getting involved to some degree militarily, and then Sudan, who seems so far not to have been involved, though some talk of how they might be involved. What do you think the calculations are right now in Kampala and Khartoum, and how can they be constructive actors in this situation?
I think the danger with Kampala is that they have, and they've not hidden that this is their view, that they see South Sudan as a springboard for changing the regime in Khartoum. I mean, they don't make any secret of that. Therefore, they are very supportive of President Kiir and maintaining this regime and their position in it. And that's potentially very dangerous, especially if it draws a response from Sudan, which, as you said, so far is staying back and out of it. I can see a role for the Ugandans strengthening the security of Juba, because a fall of Juba would be disaster, really. It would create a political vacuum and a chaos. But beyond that, if they were to engage actively in the fighting, and it would split IGAD, after all, Sudan's a member of IGAD, and complicate the situation. So I think containing Uganda's role is important.
As far as Khartoum is concerned, their main interest is in securing the continued flow of oil and oil revenues. Secondly, they must, I suppose, be reasonably pleased with the understanding that seems to have been developed between President Bashir and President Salva in recent months, which is, from their point of view, a helpful development. Not least because, third point, that reduces, and the conflict also reduces, of course, southern ability to support the SPLM fighting in Nuba Mountains and southern Blue Nile. I would contend that rather than see this as a moment of weakness and to pursue the illusion, because it is an illusion, of military victory in those states, this is the moment for Khartoum to be encouraged to make a really good offer to the SPLM that they would have difficulty in refusing. Recognition as a party, participation in government, a country-wide assembly to debate the new constitution and division of reduced resources and so on. This is a moment when they could be statesmanlike if encouraged to do so. Sadly, I fear they will miss the opportunity and resort to continued military offensive. But there is an opportunity there.
You're talking about within Sudan.
Sudan, I'm talking about now.
Yeah.
Gone off topic, sorry.
That's okay, it's all related. And let's turn now to U.S. options and policy in particular, and especially to the question of leverage. And Kate, we'll start with you on this. We talk a lot about leverage. It was a big point of discussion in the Senate hearing in which a couple of you participated yesterday. Where is U.S. leverage to be found in this situation?
Yeah, that's the, I guess, million-dollar question at the moment here in Washington. I do think that the United States has, because of our history with South Sudan and how it came into being, we do have a very deep reservoir of goodwill with the people of South Sudan, not just for the whole CPA process, but I think for decades of humanitarian assistance and sustenance during the conflict years. That's very important in terms of, I think, the role that the United States can still bring to the table here. Certainly our voice diplomatically, both bilaterally and multilaterally, is very important. I think with, influencing the two protagonists to stop fighting, that's where relationships matter most, and the weight of the world that we can bring to bear on just how serious the situation is important. And that's why yesterday in my testimony, and I think we had agreement pretty much on our panel, that moving to targeted sanctions was something, sadly, that the United States needs to be doing here because the parties are dragging their feet and not getting the ceasefire done and finding all sorts of reasons to continue with fighting, and so I, for one, am very reluctant, very sad to have to come to that point. But pressure on the leadership, in particular, that persists in fighting is critically important, and the U.S. needs to level all the tools that we can at that. I do believe that on the aid side, this is a question that came up yesterday in terms of the level of assistance that the United States gives to South Sudan, which runs the gamut of humanitarian development, security sectors. It's a pretty robust program, and of course the largest bilateral donor for South Sudan. I don't think that cutting the development assistance is a big motivating factor for either Riek Machar or Salva Kiir, frankly. While I believe that South Sudan still needs donor support and will need it to get out of this crisis, they're already very weakened economically. Clearly, the concern for their citizens and their people is not what's motivating the current actions. And further withdrawing our support from the people of South Sudan doesn't make their situation any better and doesn't change the dynamic at the table over a ceasefire in the most immediate sense. I pointed out to the Senate that Foreign Relations Committee that the United States has been providing development assistance in South Sudan since at least 1998. And so, we had our prohibition go into effect because of the political events in Khartoum in the north, and for a whole host of reasons, development aid overall was cut off. In the late 90s, it was restarted in southern Sudan in stable pockets, working through local partners and international partners, and then eventually to the newly independent government of South Sudan. There are many modalities for how the aid program can be run going forward, depending on where this all falls out. And if we end up in a protracted conflict situation, civil war, or we're able to get back to a nonviolent situation, but look at how to rebuild and pick up the pieces going forward. And we need to be creative about that, but not lose the gains that have been made, and there have been some on the development front.
You know, the best form of leverage is when everybody assumes you have it and it's not tested. And when it's tested, you find out what the limits are. And where the limits are is when you try and advise leaders or individuals where they think their vital interests are at stake, whether it's power or money or something else. And I think we're seeing that in the pressure being brought on Salva Kiir to release the detainees, and he's saying no. But the fact is that, of course, we, because of our role in a variety of ways, have a lot of leverage in this situation. And we are very important to lending international support to the IGAD process. We've gone through that with the AUHIP process. They're out in front, but the international community, by backing it up with the Security Council and a whole variety of aid and diplomatic efforts, strengthens that process. And the same will be true here. I think the question of targeted sanctions. I think for South Sudan, where the leverage probably comes is in the fear that that this leadership might actually become isolated from American support. That whereas we have been really such strong backers of South Sudan's independence, et cetera, that suddenly they become the pariahs. And that will ripple across investment, it'll ripple across acceptability, it'll ripple across access to resources, it could result in arms embargoes, et cetera. That's where the leverage really is, but you've got to bring that home to the parties.
Yeah.
You know, in South Sudan, there are only two categories of people: villains of various hues and victims. And my problem about so-called targeted sanctions is that the collateral damage for the victims, the mass of people of South Sudan, is likely to be far too great. It will impact not just, as Princeton says, investment and business such as it is, but also the activities of aid workers and so on. I want to make a different point about US leverage. That depends on presence. And unless you have a US presence in South Sudan will suffer. It's very simple. The sooner the embassy can be got back up to strength, assuming all the people there did a good job, but conceding that point, the sooner it's back up to strength, the sooner American and other NGO workers can get back in, the better. I'll make a related point too. You Americans have an excellent, excellent ambassador in South Sudan who knows the personalities and the people extremely well. She is not allowed to have a supporter in the embassy, a member of staff, on longer than a one-year tour. She's on a 3-year tour. You cannot be a diplomat anywhere, and I speak from 40 years experience, on the basis of a maximum tour of 1 year. Hardly have you got your feet under the table, but you're thinking how to get the packers in to move out and go on somewhere else. It's just not doable. So the message, if you want leverage in South Sudan, you need to be there. And by the way, the same applies to Khartoum. It is quite ridiculous that we have sitting here amongst us the last American ambassador to Khartoum who left post as a resident ambassador in 1996. Like it or not, Sudan is part of the problem of South Sudan. You need to be able to influence people in Khartoum at the highest level and have leverage there too. That's enough preaching from the choir.
I want to echo some of Alan's points, but also clarify targeted sanctions in terms of what I mean is travel bans, asset freezes on specific individuals in the leadership, not blanket sanctions on trade and development assistance and some of the broader measures that the United States also has in its toolkit. But on the presence points, I absolutely couldn't agree more. We can't have leverage. We can't play the positive role that hopefully we can play if we're not there, one, to know what's really going on, and two, to continue the relationships and to be in those critical moments in discussions and daily managing what's happening on the ground. It's impossible to imagine the United States being effective by remote control. And so for the USAID program, which is already, as I understand it, wholly evacuated, minus maybe some support to keeping the compound functioning overall, and for Ambassador Page to be there functioning with only one or two people perhaps is just really critical for us. It's a difficult thing, the trade-off between risks to security of personnel and having impact and performing the job that U.S. government officials are there to do. And we've seen those trade-offs all too close, in fact, in Sudan, and know what they are in South Sudan. But the United States State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development, they cannot do their jobs if they're not there, and they have to be there for more than a year. I agree with that as well.
Last word on this?
Well, I think, this is a very difficult situation. Let's be frank, in the post-Benghazi period, how long do you keep your people in a volatile situation? I think it's vital that Ambassador Page be present. She does a terrific job. She's working under extraordinary circumstances and still doing very active role. But people are worried about that security situation, and I hope that there's sufficient security and stability in Juba that she stays, because I agree with Ellen that your presence says a lot, not only because of all the work that's done, but what it symbolizes if you're there and you're working day and night on this problem. So I know they've added security to the embassy, and I hope it's sufficient to allow her to continue to work, because with all the good work that Don Booth is doing, he's doing the back and forth and the peace process. Having an ambassador on the ground working there every day makes a tremendous difference, and it sends a signal to the South Sudanese.
Thank you. We're going to turn to questions from the audience and from our online audience. So the way this works, we have a couple of roving microphones, so if you raise your hand, I will call on you, and we'll probably take 2 or 3 questions at a time. For those of you watching online, you should be able to see a mechanism for sending in your questions, and they'll make their way up here, so please do. And let me just reiterate also my request to keep questions brief, because we want to try to squeeze in as many of them as we can. Any volunteers in the room to start? Yes, let's start here, please.
I'm Richard Jones, a friend of the Episcopal Church of Sudan. And on the question of leverage and influence, what about sacral moral authority of indigenous Sudanese church leaders? Do you think that their authority is being appreciated, promoted, used to good effect?
Thank you. If you can hand the microphone to the gentleman right here behind you.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm Othou Kotia Beach from South Sudan, a youth leader fellow at the USIP. My question is, there are so many South Sudanese who did not participate in this political violence. And yet they have been affected by this conflict. My question is, who is representing them at the peace talk?
Thank you. Good question. If you can hand the mic just over to Jeff here.
Thank you. I just wanted to my name is Jeff Millington. I just wanted to pick up on the comment from the person from the Episcopal Church, and it's also something that Kate mentioned. Kate, good to see you. It's been a long time. We talked about leverage. We talked about the leverage that the United States has in South Sudan. We talked about supporting the IGAD process. We talked about possibility of targeted sanctions. We talked about the possibility of isolating members of the government or members of the party. But I would like to also ask whether or not the moral power, the moral position of the United States, which the United States enjoys in South Sudan, doesn't that also represent a very, very strong point of leverage over that situation there? I think we have a unique situation. The United States has a unique situation in South Sudan. I think we really do have a moral position, and an awful lot of people, both in and outside of the government, look to the United States for a moral lead. And I would just like to raise the question, as we talk about efforts to possibly help in the reorganization of the SPLM, as we talk about efforts to help bring in people who are not at the negotiating table, as we talk about efforts to engage indigenous groups like the Episcopal Church, the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, in their efforts at grassroots reconciliation, is there not a role for the United States in supporting those efforts? And is that role in any way contradictory to our efforts to continue to support IGAD and some of the larger political and economic issues out there?
Thank you. Good question. So let's take these three. Perhaps to start, some combination of that first and third question, the moral authority of church leaders in particular, and also the moral authority of the United States.
Church leaders, as you know, churches are very important and very influential in South Sudanese society, but they haven't been very effective in stopping what's happening now. And the question is, how do they mobilize that influence under these circumstances? I think they have to be encouraged as we move from a straight ceasefire to a broader process, and they have to be part of whatever political process happens. But let me be terribly blunt about the question about the Sudanese who are not fighting and what they can do about it. And this is a terrible commentary to make because it's asking people to risk their lives. But I don't see any peace demonstrations inside South Sudan. I don't see women marching for peace where they have done that in West Africa at great risk in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Now, that's risky. Let me be very honest. People could get hurt very badly. But I don't think the leaders are hearing from what I would guess is a very large majority of South Sudanese who don't want this war to happen. And is that possible? Can it be mobilized? Can the diaspora help? How risky is it? I mean, I'm not asking people to, but if you want to be heard, you have to be heard. And it's not enough for somebody outside to say, you know, the majority of people are really against this, but you don't see it. That's a very tough comment to make, and I apologize if it's suggesting putting people at risk, but it's the reality.
I would just add that churches are clearly amongst the most, if not the most trusted institution in South Sudan, and have earned the confidence of the people of South Sudan, and I think the respect of the leadership, political leadership of the country. How well they're listening to them at the moment is a question that we could ask about all of our perceived sources of leverage on the leadership in South Sudan. I mean, clearly we've all not been effective enough at this point, but Archbishop Daniel Deng, to my knowledge, has been outspoken. Other church leaders are trying to raise their voice. They issued a statement, I think, in the first week of the fighting, calling on the leadership to pull back and to resist going back to war, trying to continue to draw attention to this being a political crisis and not an ethnic crisis that doesn't have to engulf all of the communities involved in that. And so the question, I guess, for us is how do we further leverage and give voice and support to those internal voices that maybe have more sway, or we would hope would have more sway with leaders and the guys who hold guns right now. But so far it seems that they're intent on prosecuting their individual, advantages, their separate advantages, and doing that militarily at the moment. To what end, it's really hard to tell, other than killing and suffering of their own people. And that is the moral problem here at the moment, and one we have to be loud and vocal about, and why we have to, I think, putting targeted sanctions on certain individuals is a statement, a moral statement of how greatly we disapprove of the behavior there. And for the United States to do that on President Kiir and his senior team, as well as on Riek Machar and those on his side that are fighting right now, is to me a terribly dramatic statement. I hope they interpret it that way in Juba. For all the perception is of the United States being soft on President Kiir and on the SPLM leadership, it really is time for us to be as crystal clear as we can that this is evil and needs to stop.
Of course, the Catholic Church and Salva Kiir as a regular massacre seems to be equally ineffective in influencing his policy. I'm afraid that the churches, entirely properly in one sense, are the representatives of the poor. They're not with a great deal of influence, moral or otherwise, because they are simply too weak. I think there is a tendency to overstate the adherence of South Sudanese to churches, whatever. But whether or not I'm right about that, it's clear that the church's influence, as Princeton has observed, is limited. I just want to add on Otho's point that apart from the dramatic remedy of peace demonstrations and so on, there must surely be ways for peaceable South Sudanese to influence their local political leaders, for whom, after all, many of them must have voted. There are already channels. For us outside, there's a lot more we could be doing in terms of small grants and aid to South Sudanese who run maybe small, maybe on a very local scale, clinics, schools, self-help organizations, who could be encouraged and heartened to receive a bit of help from outside, practical, physical, as well as moral. I think too many of our government aid agencies, and I'm thinking of DFID in particular in London, are now going for big projects, dramatic, large checks to be written, whereas you can do a lot more good with $100 here or there to people who really need the help.
Thank you. Let's take a few more questions. Let's go up in the top right there. Sorry.
Hi, FARA Council Institute for Inclusive Security. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate so much of the context and suggestions. My question is going to focus on women, and it reflects much of what's been talked about here. So I'm personally having quite a hard time tracking all that women are doing in response. I cannot keep track of everything I am hearing about, from the diaspora here in the US to Juba, to Nairobi, to Uganda, to interlocuting between the parties, to providing humanitarian response, to pushing for a seat at the table. There is so much happening. So the question really is how to engage with that, how outside international community can engage with that, can leverage it or leverage it, how we can really work with that as much as possible. And I would ask both Ambassador Gulti and Ambassador Lyman to comment. I know you've been involved in processes that you've either personally engaged women or have been working with people that engaged them. What has been successful about that? What have those women brought to the process? I would just love your comments and thoughts about how to engage what is happening now in response. And just to note that these women are coming together across ethnic lines. They are talking honestly about what has happened. They are sharing their grief, their pain, their angry, and they're mobilizing. So that's something that I think is a huge force that we can all look to leverage. Thank you.
Thank you. And let's go right in the middle here, please. Get this microphone. You're on your other side. No, right here, please. Rebecca, here. There you go. Thank you.
You get to got lots of mics now.
Me, right?
Yes. And even
Hi,
if it
my name is
wasn't.
Rebecca Thor, and I'm here on behalf of Alliance for South Sudanese in Diaspora. You had mentioned earlier if we were to mobilize here in diaspora. I wanted to ask to see what initiatives could we take to make our voices heard here in diaspora? What can we do as Southern Sudanese here in diaspora as a united one voice?
Thank you. And just to your left, over to Doug.
Hi, Doug Brooks. I'm a local consultant on African issues. My question is about the Chinese, who probably have the biggest financial stake in South Sudan right now. Is there some way we can engage their services a bit more to help address this problem?
Thank you. Three great questions. Let's start on Farah's question initially on women's engagement. This was something I think you spent a lot of time on in your time in office.
I did, and the role of the women's groups was building in both Sudan and South Sudan, and you'll recall that, or some of you will recall, that they put together a joint commission delegation at the last, not the last, but the previous AAU summit, which had a strong bearing on the peace process, North-South, or Sudan, South Sudan, laying out very specific, concrete objectives, having an impact on the AUHIP. The women's groups in South Sudan have been very much involved previously in both domestic peace processes as well as a number of other activities, a very dynamic group. I haven't heard very much about what's happening under these current circumstances. But they also were not, and were avoiding, I think, getting involved in politically partisan issues. Now it seems the challenge for them is, can they stand up and speak out more forcefully for keeping communities from splitting apart. But I think they could play an extraordinarily important role, and I'm just not in touch enough to know what they have been doing in these last few weeks.
Men want power, women want peace.
Enough said.
If only that worked, it's not always true, unfortunately. I can say that because I'm the woman on stage.
Exceptions for my colleague. No, you kindly referred to my work. I'm a very lowly official in an organization called Women's Education Partnership, which is registered in Virginia and which supports women's and other groups in South Sudan. It's small beer, but there are very dynamic women doing great work to help their communities. We keep away from politics, so we don't go directly to the answer to your question. But if you want something done to help the community, whether it's literacy classes or HIV/AIDS outreach, go to the women. I just want to add one point, which is of general relevance, I think, to Americans, and that is that in the course of their campaign against guinea worm over the past 20 years or so, the Carter Center have succeeded in mobilizing up to 20,000 South Sudanese paid workers, but mostly volunteers, to take part in the campaign to pass the word to people in their own villages or their own neighborhoods. And it seems to me that if you've got that amount of civic spirit in South Sudan, which can be mobilized by an outside group, admittedly well-funded and so on, but then many outside groups can be well-funded, That's a resource that we ought to be exploring and developing a bit more.
Kate, on this question, and perhaps to add on the diaspora question as well.
Yeah, I think the crux of the matter comes back to how do we relate to these citizen voices, whether they're women, whether they're diaspora, whether they're youth organizations and leadership inside South Sudan and externally. How can they use their voice to hold their leaders to account? And to make known their displeasure or their support for different behaviors and different action. And those linkages are so weak in South Sudan, and I think understandably so, given where South Sudan has come from. But this is the state-society linkages, the social contract, the feedback loops that need to be built and exercised are really critical in this moment. But going forward, this is the top level political settlement discussions. It's not just a game of who gets which cards and how many do you hold in your side of your half of the deck kind of thing. It's what do the people of South Sudan want in terms of how power and resources are allocated and what their share and say is in that. And so, unfortunately, those avenues aren't well developed in terms of how to take those voices and channel them productively back to leadership. But doing anything that will visibly, vocally let leaders know and ideally permeate the little bubbles that each side seems to exist in at the moment. That their population is deeply unhappy. The citizens do not support what path they're currently being taken down. So whether it's demonstrations, whether it's continuing to issue, there was a very compelling letter from a number of diaspora, I think here in North America, that was circulated on the internet, finding any means possible to let leaders consistently and constantly know you're out of sync with us, and ultimately this is our country. It's been very inspiring. In fact, on Twitter, for however deeply that permeates in South Sudan, which is not very far at all, but a number of South Sudanese voices, really trying to rally around I choose peace and my tribe is South Sudan, and those are the sentiments and the spirit that needs to be amplified and given support to in whatever appropriate way we can as outsiders, while not trampling on and over directing those initiatives and energies.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add on diaspora?
Well, two things. First, do no harm. The diaspora in some situations, and not necessarily in this one, contribute to warfare in their countries by fueling one side or the other with arms and money. So I would hope that the diaspora would organize and discourage any of that on one side or the other. Second, speak in a coordinated voice as much as possible, publicly and in an outspoken way across all the different groupings, to say to the leadership and to all the contacts that you have, South Sudan, this is a direction you don't support and you don't want to see aggravated, particularly the descent of a political dispute into a terrible ethnic warfare that will leave scars for generations to come. I think the diaspora here probably has a lot of contact in the country, and I think the more those voices can be heard, the more they are brought together in organized, broad-scale way, I think that can be very helpful.
And then to Doug's question on Chinese engagement here and how it can be helpful. You want to start on that?
Well, it's interesting that the Chinese envoy has been in Addis. Chinese envoy doesn't usually participate in those processes in Addis. He's been there. He's working with the other envoys and with the IGAD people. Look, the Chinese will want stability. They will urge it. They will want to see the oil, obviously, sector restored, etc. The Chinese are usually, however, reluctant to get involved in the details of the political follow-on. What does it take? How do you bring... They don't like to get involved in local politics. but they will be helpful as a voice for stability, sending that signal, the cost to them of what's happening in the oil sector, and I'm glad to see that the presence of the envoy in Addis. I think that's a step forward for them, and I think it's a good thing.
Anything to add on China?
I saw a suggestion the other day that the Chinese might be invited to join the Troika. It seemed to me an imaginative idea which is worth consideration, if not pursuing.
We're going to go to two questions that we got from our online audience and also from some of the people who are in the overflow room here. First one is, what can be done to enhance UNMISS capacity to protect civilians? A very important one. The second one, and I'm glad this is coming up, is discussion has resurfaced over whether an international trusteeship should be part of any peace agreement. Do you think this would be a viable arrangement to foster recovery from this crisis? So UNMISS and trusteeship.
Look, UNMISS has to change its focus. It needs a very aggressive military commander who is not afraid to have his forces go out there and make sure that anybody who tries to breach those compounds will be shot down. I'm being very blunt. That's not the kind of aggression we've seen on the part of UNMISS. It hasn't been their role before. It's got to be their role now. They have to make it absolutely clear that those compounds are unbridgeable. And that takes other expertise to make sure those compounds are well protected. And there's a lot of different things that have to be done. They have to reorganize with more troops coming in to be much more proactive on elsewhere in the country where civilian populations are in danger. They have to be clear on reporting without fear or varnish to the Security Council when there's violations. So I think the role of UNMISS has to change from what it's been. It's been largely a state-building operation. That's really what it was structured for, mostly civilians, not military. I think it needs much stronger, proactive, tough activity on the part of protection. Then subsequently, whether in helping monitor the ceasefire, eventually working with integrating the military, et cetera. But right now, they have to show a very tough face on protection.
I just tack on to that the known numbers of internally displaced are, I think, just over 200,000, and 60,000 of those are within UNMISS compounds or bases. That means the vast majority of the displaced are not inside those compounds. They are outside, and probably far more are displaced than we actually know of at the moment and affected by the conflict. So figuring out how UNMISS can not only make those compounds inviolable, but more importantly, for the bulk of the population that's affected, how can they get out and do civilian protection outside of the UNMISS compounds? And that becomes an even harder and even riskier challenge as long as the fighting goes on, and why we critically need a ceasefire and for these parties to stop the shooting, because there's just, it's very hard to see how you can quell that level and really provide the protection that's needed to far too many people right now. So,
I agree with Princeton on the need for much stronger leadership in UNMISS, and with Kate on the need for UNMISS to get out proactively. To do that, they need two things. One is a vast increase in their transport, particularly helicopter capacity. There is absolutely no point putting 1,000 more troops into Juba when you need to get these people out around Jonglei, Upper Nile, Unity, the flashpoints. And you've got to be able to move them. Helicopters are however difficult it is to find them, are an absolute essential. The other thing, going back to the Nuba Mountain experience I mentioned earlier, is that UNMISS needs to do far more in getting to know the people in the area for which each unit is responsible. Reaching out to whether they're warlords or local politicians or women's groups, they've got to get engaged in the community. They cannot just sit in their barracks or their compounds waiting for something to happen to them.
And on this question of trusteeship, and I might add that I think trusteeship is sort of at one pretty far end of the spectrum in terms of options, but there are other options as well in terms of different levels of international engagement once things are put back together. Are these different variations of international engagement in running South Sudan? Are any of these good options?
Well, you won't go to formal trusteeship, but I think it would be hard to do politically, but I do think the relationship between the international community and the South Sudan has to change. I think there's no doubt that this political process that hopefully will take place should have very substantial international involvement and oversight. Experts working directly in the Constitutional Commission, ensuring its independence, that it's widely participatory, even an expert panel from the AU and the UN and others to review that Constitution. I think there has to be, and the South Sudanese had promised this over a year ago but didn't follow through, a really joint partnership on the management of the economy and the oversight of the oil sector. The international community is going to pick up the pieces and the costs of this conflict. I think the international community has to say that means we have to be a major player in how this is all put back together. It's going to be politically challenging to do so, but I think it's necessary.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on this perhaps, and a lot to think back and reflect upon, having sat in a USAID seat as we went through the CPA process and stood up the USAID Sudan mission, which was reopened again in 2006, and formally put the structures of a development mission back in place for South Sudan and parts of Sudan. It's challenging to think how can the donor-host government relationship be adjusted going forward. I personally don't believe that we can somehow run South Sudan for the South Sudanese, we the international community, we the United States. That's not how states are built. That's not how institutions develop. Just because we think we know how to do it in other places and it works for us, for instance, in our country or in other experiences, South Sudanese, this is their state. They have to run it. They have to own it. They have to decide what the arrangements are that make sense for the people and for the government. And that means there will be a lot of things tried that don't work out. We have our own history of trying a number of arrangements in the United States and then moving on to ones that have stood the test of time, thankfully, and been enduring institutions for us. We can't short-circuit that for South Sudan. We should be as helpful as possible, as supportive as possible, as I think encouraging as possible on the principles that seem to have worked for a number of countries and a number of experiences, and there's good knowledge base to support all that. But for us to come in and do it ourselves or for them is really just not, to me, not a logical thought to go there. As difficult as it is to watch how this has fallen apart and to think back, if we had only done this, if we had only done that. There were discussions. We had an agreement. We, USAID, had an agreement with Dr. Garang going into the signing of the CPA that USAID would initially contract and provide the procurement agent for the interim government of Southern Sudan. And then a variety of things happened in the donor discussions and with the government, and that didn't happen and emerged that way. And we can see that maybe that was a missed opportunity to at least preclude some of the possibilities for corruption, for instance, that's taken place since the oil revenues have been flowing to South Sudan. Maybe there are ideas like that in specific aspects that could be revisited where there is a more joint donor relationship in terms of how that goes. But I guess I would just caution us and point to the literature that really identifies politics and indigenous processes in terms of building institutions. And if we come in and change the balance of power from the outside, then we aren't building an institution, we're just supplanting it or replacing it. And eventually we will leave, and then South Sudanese will still have to go through their process. So finding the balance of how we support South Sudanese in their state-building moment, but also put some parameters on, it clearly can't go like this, and where we see loss of life and a lot of destruction and suffering. But
I agree entirely with Kate that South Sudan has to be run by South Sudanese with, of course, international support and backing, advice if necessary. One thought is that we might perhaps, as donors, do a little bit more to encourage South Sudanese who find themselves in our countries to facilitate their return to help rebuild their own country. Because there's a lot of talent, I see quite a lot in this room, but a lot of talent in Britain, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, other places, which could be put to very good use. And I think people concerned would like to be able to do that if they could be reassured that their families would be as well off as they are now, wherever they find themselves. I can't resist adding, John, that it's a real pleasure to have an American questioner harking back to the days of the British Empire.
Well said. Probably our final round of questions here. We're going to start in the middle, at the very top there.
Thank you. Abdulrahim Fuqar, I'm the Bureau Chief of Al Jazeera Arabic here in DC. Just a quick thought to Ambassador Gulti. I want to hark back to the days of Margaret Thatcher. Anybody who knew her knew that she was just as hungry for power as any male prime minister or president.
The exception that proves the rule.
My question now to Ambassador Lyman. Do you think that the division of Sudan, that's where it stops between the North and South? Or do you think that it could possibly be open to more division and subdivision? And where does US interest lie in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go to a question, gentleman, right here, please.
Excuse me, could you pass?
Do I need to get up?
Yeah, please. Oh, either way.
Yes.
Ambassador Koch of South Sudan to the US. I have a short comment and
Please.
a question. The comment is about democracy and justice. Now, we have detainees who have been accused of plotting a coup, participating in a plotted coup. And for justice to free them and for democracy to be seen properly functioning, there is need for an investigation to clear those who are not involved and to try those who will be seen to be involved. Again, we know that unfortunately in 1991, Dr. Riek Machar, the former vice president, wanted to become the leader of the SPLM. And when he could not succeed, he rebelled. Again, it is the same thing today. Many people have died. Where is the place for accountability? Not only for him, but for any other person who is involved in the violation of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to a question over here on the side, please.
My name is Mowadio from South Sudan. My question is, since now you have talked about two levels of stopping this violence or taking South Sudan back to being a peaceful country, you said cessation of hostilities that is being negotiated in Addis Ababa, and also another level is to political settlement. You have talked briefly about constitution reform, SPLM reform, meaning also what could we do with the SPLM? Could we split it or something like that? But there is outstanding step here, and that is, how are these two leaders going to be brought together, Riek Machar and President Kiir? Does that mean a political sharing need to be done in this regard? Because those things like political reform, constitutional reforms will come later. But the immediate one is, how could you accommodate these two leaders together? Comes peace. Okay, let's say if there is a cessation of hostilities, are you going to have a power sharing agreement, considering now they are being kind of treated as two camps, not like there is a government and maybe the rebel. It sounds like there is a camp of Dr. Riek Machar and camp of President Kiir. They are being, according to international languages and something like that, they are being treated as equal oppositions in this level. So are they going to have a political sharing or power sharing in these regards when cessation of hostilities is going to be done? Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are good questions to end on. The first one, I believe, went to Ambassador Lyman. Are we going to see any more splits?
I wouldn't think so. I don't think it's helpful to start to fragment South Sudan. You still have fighting over the resource. The main source of income is oil. I don't think that's the answer to the problem. You would create just a very unstable situation.
Okay. And then the final question, which I think is a good summing up of a lot of what we've talked about here, the fundamental issue of how to bring these two leaders together, and also the notion of power sharing, which we've seen discussed a lot. Kate?
Yeah, this is a critical question, and as best as I understand, there are key figures that are amongst the political detainees who have important relationships with Riek Machar, who probably are vital to getting beyond a ceasefire to finding out what the power sharing arrangement can be. Personally, I don't think it's possible to conceive that either Salva Kiir or Riek Machar are going to negotiate even an interim political settlement that neither one is involved in, and that's their starting positions. Riek Machar wants the president to step down, and of course, I would think that President Kiir doesn't believe that Riek Machar has any place, since he's already dismissed him as his vice president in sharing power. I think that's where, through the IGAD mediators, through the Troika and other voices on the outside, we have to be very clear that there is no solution. Neither one is going to get their desired goal there. And to figure out an interim way forward, it unfortunately probably means that they're each part of the equation for some part of time. Ambassador Lyman's already, I think, expressed his view on whether they get to be part of the equation, in the longer term. And I would have to say, personally, and not as a South Sudanese, I think they both disqualified themselves. I think accountability is not just on Riek Machar. I think it's also on President Kiir. It did not have to devolve this way. Whatever the instigation was on December 15th, there is no justification for what's happening right now. And the government owns that problem just as much as those in opposition and in rebellion do. And so that's vitally important that they both hear that message and understand there will be consequences for those actions. And part of that will be any political support from the outside for the role that they play in the longer-term future of South Sudan, in my view.
Thank you. Ambassador Gulti?
I think Kate and our questioner sum up very well the dilemma of how to bring together two people who want the same thing. It's like a referendum, isn't it? One side is bound to lose. And I'm glad for once that I'm not one of those mediators trying to devise a compromise that will enable things to move forward. I just add that we've got to remember, of course, that though these two are the two we're focusing on at the moment, there are a lot of other declared and undeclared candidates for the presidency. There is Pagan Amum, there's Lama Kol from the opposition, who is now, I see, in Salva's delegation to Addis. There is James Wani, who has the vice president slot at the moment, and no doubt there will be a raft of Dinka contenders, including Nyang Deng, when the time comes. So it's much more complicated. What needs to be done is a patched up job so that there is some form of administration in the short term. And there are only two possibilities. Either both men are in or both men are out. And the mediators will have to edge towards one of those options. I think it is worth saying, and Princeton hinted at this earlier, that there's a lot the mediators can do by using back channels, who, if you do it in public with our friends from the press and the media there, then people are going to be inhibited. You need trusted intermediaries, and this is where some of the international support can come in support of the mediation, to contact either the parties directly or the friends of the parties, so that they can explore possibilities privately that can't be explored openly. So don't despair of the mediation. They're ingenious, they're experienced, and they've got a lot of help. Something can be worked out.
Last word to you.
There's two levels of power sharing. One is two individuals, and the other is power sharing among entities and interest groups in the country, whether it's ethnic, ideological, geographic, or otherwise. It's the second form of power sharing that has to be worked out politically over a longer period of time. So it can take place within a constitutional framework, within political competition, and not military competition. That's the longer term challenge for power sharing. In the short term, what do you do about two individuals who both want to be president? I don't think you can go back to the status quo ante. There's not going to be a deal where Riek Machar comes back and he's vice president again. That just puts you back where you were. I think it's going to be very difficult to put these two people together in a government, even in the short term. How you deal with that, on the one hand, yes, President Kiir bears some of the responsibility, but he's also the democratically elected president. And that makes him different than Riek Machar, who is in opposition and fighting. Those have to be worked out. I don't know the exact formula, and I think it's going to be a lot of work. But I think the idea you can just go back in the short term to the status quo ante is not there. And somehow that's going to be dealt with. And then you've got to deal with the more fundamental concepts of power sharing that can be developed in a constitutional framework.
Thank you. We do need to conclude now. Obviously, these conversations will be continuing for some time, and I'm sure we'll be having more of them. Let me conclude by, again, thanking our partners at the Wilson Center for collaborating with us on this, for thanking our panelists for what I think was a very useful conversation, and for thanking all the guests, both in the room and online. Thanks.